Hello everyone. We're going to continue talking about these two-dimensional design principles that we've been discussing. In the prior videos, we've looked at balance and composition and emphasis and focal point. And in this video here, we're going to talk about rhythm and repetition. These might seem like strange concepts to discuss with the visual arts. We typically think about these ideas when we're discussing music, right? With sound, we can see how this works quite easily, right? The repetition of a fixed rhyme or a beat or a melody is essentially how we create music and musical harmony. But if we think about it, musical harmony is simply just layers of organized, repeating sounds to produce pleasing tones that we enjoy. So the same can be said for visual rhythm, right? We can create more aesthetically pleasing images and better compositions by a stronger understanding of how repetition and rhythm can apply to the visual arts. Again, repetition. In visual production, it is the reoccurrence of a particular line, pattern, shape, or other visual element in a single or part of the series. Now, these two go hand in hand, repetition and rhythm, but I'm going to show you some images that more or less isolate repetition and can show how repetition can function in these images. I'll show you some images here from Andy Warhol. This is his Marilyn Monroe series, and Andy Warhol was a pop artist that liked to work with mass media and culture and advertisements, and he worked with screen printing, and he took materials from newspapers and photographs and paintings, and we can see he uses repetition to play with meaning and forms. Now, repetition by itself, it can seem quite boring and monotonous, but when things are repeated to this extent, visual interest can occur. Right? We seem to have this innate ability to recognize and be drawn to patterns. Often these repetitions are called tessellations. Here we have M.C. Escher's work, who is known for doing these. And a tessellation is the tiling of a plane using one or more repeating geometric shapes with no overlaps and no gaps. You may have seen these before. Mondrian was an artist in the early 20th century who was a painter, theorist, and writer who thought that art should reflect the underlying spirituality of nature surrounding us. So he stripped down his work. He took his work down to the essential geometric shapes and only used primary colors. And through these repeated horizontal and vertical strips of squares and rectangles, he was hoping to establish a strict vocabulary that represented the ideas that he believed in. Here's some works by Yu Minjun. He's a Chinese artist that uses repetition here quite humorously. He uses his own face, usually in this state of hysterical laughter. And these can be quite unsettling and disturbing, but also quite funny at the same time. But we can see how the repeated forms of his face become the central focus elements to these works. Here's some more here, using repetition to create meaning. Another artist that uses repetition quite humorously, but also disturbing as well. This is Layla Ali, who did a series from 1996 to 2005. These are called the Greenhead series. Now, these works often explore themes like political unrest, social justice. But there's a dark undertone to these pieces as well, but we can see the power coming through the work is through the repeated forms. If this was just one single entity, it wouldn't have the same impact or the same meaning. So, to think about how repetition can really be pushed, I want to show you some images here of a glass of water. This is an artist named Peter Dreyer who paints these water glasses. And by itself, this image is quite boring, wouldn't we say? It doesn't particularly adhere to any of the compositional rules we've discussed, right? There's no diagonals. It's not structured by the rule of thirds. It's a single object in the middle, not very much color. The focal point, right, is the glass itself through placement. But again, by itself, this image doesn't represent that much to us. But now if we start to repeat this image, I want you to think about what this artist could potentially be thinking about. So now we have 3. If we continue adding to this painting of a glass cup, how could this repeated form start to convey meaning? Or what meanings could we gather from these repeated cups? This artist has done this painting over 5,000 times. He's painted half of these at night, half of these during the day in his studio. And every single glass, it's the same glass, but he is essentially trying to express the idea of seeing something for the first time every time he's seen it, right? Even though he's seen this cup and he could paint it by memory, conceptually, he's thinking about how he could apply this idea to his life. Every time he sees this cup, he tries to pretend that this is the first time he's ever seen it. So he paints it in a fresh way every single time. Moving on to rhythm here. So we've seen how repetition can work, but how does rhythm play into this? Well, in art, in design, rhythm is the regular harmonious reoccurrence of a specific element, often a single specific entity coming from the categories of line, shape, form, color, light, shadow, and sound. So rhythm is directly tied to repetition, or rhythm is caused by repetition, but not all repetition has rhythm, if that makes sense. And when we study visual imagery, when we study the arts, we can almost find rhythm in any image, right? We can look at the style, the technique, brushstrokes, colors, and patterns. Rhythm in design that has a clear pattern is something that we recognize through human perception, and it's something that we find to be quite visually stimulating and interesting. And there's different types of rhythm, right? We have flowing rhythm here. When we think about rhythm, we often associate it with movement. We can have a progressive rhythm that creates a reverberating shape or a form from a single point and moves outwards and follows a path. Repetition in forms can also be a shape that reoccurs by regular intervals or certain patterns to help create a design. Here we see the repeating floor tiles that convey a rhythmic movement. In architecture, we have structural rhythm, right? This is created when the materials themselves, such as beams and columns and stairs, form repetitive elements similar in size and dimension. So remember, as long as a basic element is repeated with an ordered sequence, typically a pleasing pattern will emerge and be created, and that would be identified as a rhythm. This phenomena creates visual attraction and will generate a pleasing aesthetic. And here we have Marcel Duchamp and Van Gogh. We can see the repetition here through their use of brushstrokes and forms, and it creates a rhythm, particularly on the starry night, right? We can see the sky is moving quite nicely. Okay, so that's rhythm and repetition, and moving forward, we're going to now jump into proportion and scale.